The Trans-Saharan trade, Africa's forgotten trauma, and the identity hangover. Nobody wants to talk about. If history were a courtroom drama, the transatlantic slave trade would be the loud, theatrical defendant. Always in the dock, always in the documentaries, always in the school books. Meanwhile, its quieter accomplice, the Trans-Saharan slave trade, would be the shady figure sitting in the back row, wearing dark glasses and pretending to read the Quran, hoping nobody calls its name. But call it we must, because Africa's historical trauma didn't just come from the West. A great deal of it rode on camels, crossed deserts, and settled into the cultural psyche of entire regions in ways we still haven't fully unpacked. The Shadow Empire. Nobody talks about the Arab invasions and centuries of trans-Saharan slave trading carved deep psychological grooves across North and East Africa, grooves so subtle that many modern Africans don't recognize the fingerprints on them. In North Africa, Arabization wasn't simply a cultural influence, it was full reupholstering. Language, religion, aesthetics, even concepts of identity were wrapped in a new cloth. Many North Africans today will confidently declare, "We aren't African, we are Arab," while standing firmly on the African continent, drinking African water, and arguing over the African Cup of Nations. Identity is a powerful thing, and colonialism, whether European or Arab, is extremely good at rearranging it. Somalia, the case study in identity gymnastics. If you want to understand the long-term psychological impact of this forgotten trade, look no further than Somalia. Somalia is Africa's identity paradox wearing a beautifully patterned makawis. Many Somalis today, faced with complex historical and social circumstances, culturally lean northward across the Red Sea rather than westward across the continent. Some speak of Arabic heritage with pride, distancing themselves from the very continent they inhabit, as though Africa were a rowdy neighbor they would rather not be associated with. It's the historical equivalent of someone in a London council flat insisting they are descended from the House of Windsor because their uncle once worked at Buckingham Palace. But this identity crisis didn't appear out of thin air. It's rooted in the centuries-long trade system that moved millions of Africans northward and eastward, often under brutal and dehumanizing conditions. A system so quiet, so unrecorded, and so conveniently unmentioned in Arab historical narratives that Africans themselves sometimes forget it happened. If trauma had a publicist, the Trans-Saharan trades one was brilliant. It kept everything off the record. Africa's North. The continent within a continent, North Africans often see themselves as part of the broader Arab world, emotionally and culturally. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Identity is complex and layered. But the insistence that Arabic heritage erases African identity is where the historical wound shows. When an Egyptian insists, "We are not Africans," Nigerians often respond, "But you play in the AFCON. You are literally in the group stage." Meanwhile, Morocco wins AFCON matches and still debates whether to celebrate like Africans or Arabians. Tunisia plays African teams but identifies as Middle Eastern. Algeria sends teams to African competitions while half the squad speaks about Africa like they're visiting cousins. Identity is fascinating until it becomes farce. The real question, what does Africa see in the mirror? History doesn't just live in textbooks, it lives in how people see themselves. The trans-Saharan slave trade left psychological consequences that outlived its camel caravans. A hierarchy that placed Arab identity above African identity. Social systems in East Africa where people tried to whiten their roots. Communities that internalized the idea that African identity was something to escape rather than to embrace. It's historical gaslighting, centuries in the making. And while Africa has healed loudly from European colonialism, it has barely whispered about the internal scars left by the Arab one. In conclusion, Africa deserves its whole story, but if the continent is ever to fully understand itself, it must face both halves of its trauma, the European ships and the Arab caravans. Both rearranged African identity, sometimes violently, often subtly, and always with long-term consequences. The trans-Saharan trade may have been the quieter sibling of the Atlantic trade, but its psychological impact still echoes from Cairo to Mogadishu and from Khartoum to the desert frontiers of Mali. Africa must reclaim its story, not the edited version, not the convenient version, but the whole version. Because healing doesn't come from pretending, it comes from telling the truth. even the uncomfortable parts, even the parts whispered over desert winds. And perhaps one day we can all agree that everyone living on the African continent, Arab, Berber, Nilotic, Cushitic, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Fulani, or Somali, is in fact African. AFCON committees everywhere will breathe a sigh of relief.